I walked into a classroom last week. It was quiet. You could hear the fluorescent lights buzz. 20 kids were hunched over mimeograph sheets, carefully practicing their grammar. And then there was this one boy, third row back. He wasn't writing. He was staring, completely transfixed at a fly batting against the window pane. His pencil was tapping a complex rhythm on his desk, and he seemed to be, well, in a world of his own, totally absorbed. A moment later, the teacher called his name, sharply. The kid jumped, startled, and the spell was broken. Later, I overheard that same teacher in the staff room. Classic case, she was saying to a colleague. He can't sustain attention for 10 seconds, fails to finish his work. We're starting him on the medication next Tuesday. And that's the moment it clicked for me. We were watching the exact same child. But she saw a disorder. I saw a kid who was somewhere else. And what really hit me was the certainty. The absolute certainty with which his behavior was instantly labeled, and a treatment, a powerful brain-altering one, was prescribed. What if she was wrong? What if we're all wrong? That image, that immediate judgment. That's really what we're diving into today for you. It's this stark difference, isn't it? Seeing a kid just thinking, maybe observing something interesting, versus seeing a disorder, codified, certifiable.
Exactly. And the speed you mentioned, the clinical certainty that just snaps into place.
Yeah, leading straight to a prescription. It feels alarming.
It is. And we need to look past just the child's behavior, right? We need to question the whole system that allows for that kind of immediate, absolute conclusion.
So where do we start with that system?
Well, what's fascinating and maybe a bit disturbing is that the certainty isn't just based on pure science or biology. It's systemic. It's, in some ways, manufactured.
Manufactured? How so?
That's our mission today, really.
Yeah.
To explore the contexts, the systems that create that level of certainty in diagnosis. We're essentially looking at the rule book itself and how it gets written.
Okay.
So we need to focus on three, I think, really critical areas. These shape how our Western systems particularly define and treat these childhood behavioral conditions.
Right.
First, we've got to look at the history, the evolution of the diagnostic criteria, specifically in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the DSM. And crucially, we need to examine the influence of, let's be blunt, money, pharmaceutical industry influence.
Okay, the history and the money. What's second?
Second is the sort of sociological angle, how we end up pathologizing diverse temperaments in kids, the ones who just don't quite fit the standard classroom mold.
The square pegs and round holes idea?
Precisely. And third, we need to do a comparison, a really stark one, looking globally at how differently attention deficit disorder is diagnosed and treated, especially comparing the U.S. approach to, say, traditional European models. The difference is, it's shocking.
Okay, that sounds like a deep dive indeed. Let's start with that rule book, the DSM. It seems like the absolute authority. I remember reading about a mother, maybe 20 years back, her son Mark. He was just a really energetic kid, loved being outdoors, building things, not the type to sit still for hours doing math sheets. His teacher, understandably trying to manage a big class, flagged him pretty quickly. Impulsive, can't focus.
That's a common story.
Right. And the mother recalled seeing those TV ads, the direct-to-consumer ones for stimulants, showing a struggling kid suddenly becoming calm, focused, successful after taking a pill.
Oh, yes. Those ads were everywhere.
So when the pediatrician basically confirmed the school's view after a really short visit and wrote the prescription, she felt this weird mix. Relief, maybe, but also real doubt. It felt less like discovering something true about her son and more like a solution for the school that just happened to match the commercial.
That story perfectly captures that convergence, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The late 20th, early 21st century, the DSM rising to become this monolith.
It's the ultimate standard.
Published by the American Psychiatric Association, APA. It dictates what's normal, what's disease, not just in the U.S., but because of its link to the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases, it has huge global impact. Insurance claims, funding, treatment pathways, it all flows from the DSM.
So the revisions to this incredibly powerful document must be under intense scrutiny.
Oh, absolutely. Especially the move from DSM-IV to DSM-V. It sparked a firestorm of controversy.
Why specific?
Well, critics pointed fingers directly at those commercial pressures you mentioned. They asked, are we adding new disorders or widening the criteria for old ones because the science demands it? Or because it serves corporate interests?
Widening criteria means more potential patients, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
A bigger market for the drugs.
Yeah.
It's a powerful accusation.
So conflicts of interest. This is where the money trail comes in, like you said. I know the APA introduced a mandatory disclosure policy for the experts working on DSM-V. Financial conflicts of interest, FCOIs. That sounds like a good step, right? Transparency.
It sounds good. And transparency is necessary, of course.
Yeah.
But the data revealed it wasn't nearly enough to sort of neutralize the bias.
What did the analysis show?
It was striking. When researchers looked at the disclosures from the DSM-V task force members, 69% of them reported direct financial ties to the pharmaceutical industry.
69%. Wait, nearly 3/4 of the people defining mental illness have financial links to the companies selling the treatments.
That's what the data showed. And maybe even more concerning, that 69% was actually an increase compared to the DSM-IV task force.
An increase, how much?
A relative increase of 21%. The DSM-IV figure was already high, at 57%. So mandatory disclosure didn't make the problem smaller. If anything, the conflict seemed more widespread, or at least more openly reported.
Okay, but let me push back a little here. Isn't it possible that the top experts, the only ones really qualified to revise the manual, are naturally the same people doing the leading research? And that research is often funded by industry. Is it even avoidable?
That's a really fair and critical question. It forces us to ask why the funding is concentrated where it is.
What do you mean?
Well, the argument presented in the source material is that this concentration of financial ties isn't random. It clusters very specifically in the areas where drug treatments are the most common and most profitable first-line interventions.
Okay, so where did the conflicts concentrate most heavily?
The data is pretty clear. Look at the panels for heavily medicated categories. Mood disorders, that includes major depression, bipolar. 67% of those panel members had industry ties.
2/3.
Psychotic disorders panel, even higher, 83%.
Wow.
But the most extreme example was the sleep-wake disorders panel. This now includes things like restless leg syndrome, often treated with medication.
And the percentage there?
100%.
100%. Every single member.
Every single member of that panel reported industry ties.
That fact alone is staggering. If everyone defining a condition has financial links to the treatment industry, it fundamentally changes the dynamic, doesn't it? It's hard to see it as purely unbiased science.
It really challenges that perception, and it leads right into why transparency alone wasn't enough. It basically shifted the problem from, secret bias to open bias.
How does open bias still operate?
Social psychology research tells us that even small financial relationships, gifts, honoraria, create a sense of obligation, a need to reciprocate. It fosters what's been called a pro-industry habit of thought.
So it might not even be conscious.
Often not. Experts might unconsciously frame questions, interpret data, or define criteria in ways that lean towards drug solutions, even if they genuinely believe they're being objective.
And were there issues with the disclosure policy itself, ways that might have downplayed the extent of these ties?
Absolutely. Critics identified major loopholes, systemic gaps that kind of obscured the real depth of these relationships.
Like what? What were the main loopholes?
Well, 3 big ones stand out. First, the policy didn't specifically require panel members to disclose if they were part of pharmaceutical speakers bureaus.
Speakers bureaus? What does that involve?
It means the expert is hired, essentially as a marketer, a key opinion leader, or KOL. Their job is explicitly to promote specific drugs or a view of a disorder that fits those drugs.
That sounds like a direct marketing role. How could that be obscured?
It was often just lumped under the general category of honoraria, so you wouldn't necessarily know someone was being paid to actively promote a drug. An outside investigation found about 15% of panel members had disclosed being on speakers bureaus elsewhere, but it wasn't explicitly required or listed by the APA policy.
So a key marketing connection could be hidden in plain sight. What was the second gap?
The exclusion of unrestricted research grants. Panel members didn't have to disclose these large grants from industry.
But unrestricted sounds okay, doesn't it? Like, the company isn't dictating the research.
That's the argument, but critics say, look, if you receive hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of dollars from a company, even if it's labeled unrestricted, there's still a powerful implicit pressure to produce results favorable to that industry, or at least not unfavorable. It subtly steers research away from non-drug approaches.
Okay, that makes sense. And the third loophole?
The financial thresholds themselves. They're set quite high. Panel members could receive up to $10,000 a year for consultancies.
$10,000?
Yes. And they could hold up to $50,000 in stock in pharmaceutical companies.
$50,000? That seems significant.
Critics argued these thresholds were arbitrarily high. $10,000 in consulting fees isn't trivial. It's way above the zero conflict standard some ethics bodies advocate for guideline panels. It signals a kind of tacit acceptance that substantial financial ties are okay for the people defining mental illness.
So the very structure for defining disorders seems embedded in this financially conflicted environment. It's a heavy thought.
It is.
Okay, let's move from that high-level policy and financial world down to the classroom. What happens when this potentially biased blueprint gets applied to real kids with all their diverse personalities and temperaments? I read about another child, let's call him Leo. In a standard elementary school, he was always the problem child. Couldn't sit still, tapped his pencil, looked out the window, tried to take his pen apart during lessons.
Sounds familiar.
Diagnosed as oppositional, inattentive. But here's the thing. That same kid, Leo, if you put him in the garage with his grandpa to fix a broken lawnmower, he'd spend the entire Saturday focused, patient, working through the mechanics.
Interesting contrast.
Totally. He wasn't attention deficient. He was, it seems, a highly kinesthetic, hands-on learner stuck in a system demanding quiet, abstract work. His parents eventually moved him to a school that used project-based learning, building things, and suddenly his symptoms weren't problems anymore. They were strengths.
Leo's story is a perfect illustration of what some critics bluntly call the great ADD hoax.
Strong words. What's the core argument there?
The argument is that attention deficit disorder, or ADHD, isn't always a real disease. Often it's a label used to pathologize normal variations in temperament that clash with rigid environments, especially schools.
And where does their critique start?
Right, with the concept of attention itself. What is attention?
To focus, concentration.
Right, but it's internal, isn't it? It's a state of consciousness. You can't directly observe someone's attention.
You only see their behavior.
Exactly. A teacher sees fidgeting or staring out the window or interrupting. They infer a lack of attention. But it's fundamentally a guess about an internal state. And that guess is then used to justify powerful interventions, like medication.
Okay, but if the behavior is consistently causing problems, if the child is struggling in class, failing work, does it really matter if we call the behavior a symptom or the cause? The child still needs help, right?
That's the pragmatic question, absolutely. But the source material argues it matters profoundly. They say the DSM makes a preposterous logical error by claiming the symptoms, the behaviors, cause the impairment of attention.
How so?
Think about it. Symptoms are usually signs of an underlying problem. A fever is a symptom of an infection. The DSM flips it. It says behaviors like hyperactivity cause the attention deficit. Critics argue this stops us from looking for other causes, like the clash between the child's nature and the environment Leo experienced.
So we label the behavior itself as the disease rather than a sign of mismatch.
That's the essence of the critique. And to understand that mismatch, we need to talk about temperament types. You mentioned Leo seemed like a kinesthetic learner. This ties into the artisan temperament concept.
Artisan temperament. Tell us about that.
It comes from temperament theory, classifying kids based on innate traits. Artisans are described as being very concrete in how they perceive the world. They need hands-on, tangible results. And they're impulsive in action, always looking for immediate engagement, fun things to do right now.
So the doers, the builders, the tinkerers.
Exactly, the kinetic learners. Put that kind of kid in a classroom that demands sitting still, listening to abstract lectures, doing repetitive worksheets, and you're almost guaranteed to see friction.
Okay, let's use that artisan lens to re-examine some of those core DSM symptoms for ADHD. What about things like fails to follow directives, can't sustain attention, careless mistakes?
Right, let's break them down. Symptom 1, fails to follow directives or finish work. The temperament critique says this isn't inability, it's disinterest.
They're just not buying into the teacher's agenda.
Precisely. They have their own agenda, which is probably way more interesting to them at that moment. Symptom 2, doesn't sustain attention to schoolwork. The conventional view is they can't. The critique says they won't unless it's engaging. Remember Leo and the lawnmower. They can sustain attention for ages on things they find interesting or concrete. It's about engagement, not brain deficit.
Okay, and that links to careless mistakes or not bothering with details. Symptoms 3 and 5.
Yeah. The interpretation here is they couldn't care less about the boring details of, say, grammar exercises or math drills.
Because it's not relevant to their concrete, action-oriented way of thinking.
Exactly. But if those same details are crucial for a hands-on project they're interested in, it can be incredibly meticulous. The capacity for detail is there, the motivation isn't, in that standardized context.
What about being easily distracted? That's a classic one teachers mention. Symptom 4.
If you're profoundly bored and disinterested in the task at hand, Isn't distraction a welcome relief?
Huh, good point.
The critique argues distractibility isn't a brain flaw. It's a natural response to an unengaging environment. It depends entirely on how attractive the task is versus everything else around. Blame the mismatch, not the brain.
Okay, then there are the symptoms related to routine and listening. Doesn't listen, forgets routines, forgetful. Symptoms 6, 7, 9.
Right. Doesn't listen to directives. The critique suggests maybe they are listening, but choosing to ignore the teacher because the directives often mean restrictions on their impulses.
A form of resistance.
Perhaps. And the forgetfulness about routines. This ties back to that artisan impulsivity. Strict schedules limit options. These kids often prefer spontaneity, operating on the spur of the moment. Forgetting the routine isn't necessarily a memory deficit. It might be an active searching for more exciting alternatives.
This really reframes the behaviors. It's less about deficit, more about a fundamental clash. And this clash seems particularly relevant when we look at gifted kids, doesn't it? The concept of overexcitability, OE.
Yes, this is critical. Because the traits associated with giftedness, particularly these overexcitabilities described by Dabrowski's theory, can look almost identical to ADHD symptoms.
So gifted traits can be mistaken for a disorder.
Frequently. OE means an intensified way of experiencing the world, thinking, feeling, moving with greater intensity. If educators or clinicians aren't trained to see this, they might pathologize what is actually a sign of high potential or a different neurotype.
There are 5 OEs, but which ones overlap most with ADHD symptoms?
3 stand out: psychomotor, imaginational, and emotional.
Okay, let's start with psychomotor OE. What does that look like?
Think intense physical energy.
Yeah.
Restlessness, busyness, constant movement, maybe fidgeting, nail biting, leg bouncing. Impulsivity is often part of it too.
That sounds exactly like the H in ADHD hyperactivity.
It does. High activity levels, difficulty staying seated, acting without thinking. A teacher sees this boundless energy and might label it hyperactive when it could stem from this deep, intrinsic need for kinetic expression common in some gifted kids.
Okay, what about imaginational OE?
These are your classic daydreamers. They have incredibly rich inner lives, vivid fantasies. They might seem like their attention is drifting, like they're in their own world, especially during abstract or boring lessons.
So they tune out the worksheet because their internal world is just more compelling?
Precisely. It's not necessarily an inability to pay attention, but a preference for their own rich, imaginative thought processes over, say, a dull grammar exercise. Again, easily mislabeled as inattentive.
And the third one, emotional OE.
This involves experiencing emotions with unusual depth and intensity. Strong sensitivities, deep empathy, but also maybe intense anxieties, dramatic tempers, difficulty with rigid rules because their emotional response is so powerful.
And again, the overlap. Intense emotions, impulsivity, difficulty with rules. These are often cited in ADHD diagnoses.
Exactly. The core issue highlighted here is the need for better training. Professionals need to be able to differentiate. Is this a sign of a clinical deficit needing intervention, or is it an intrinsic part of this child's intense way of being, perhaps linked to giftedness, that requires understanding and accommodation, not medication?
It's a fundamentally different way of seeing the child.
Yeah.
This child has a deficit versus this child has an intensity that needs the right environment. The implications are huge.
Enormous.
Which brings us perfectly to our third area, how dramatically this whole picture, diagnosis, treatment, perception can change when you change the context, the culture, the system. Consider that story about the American family moving to France. Their son, diagnosed and medicated for ADHD for 2 years in Texas. They were anxious about the notoriously strict French schools.
Understandably so.
But the French teacher didn't see a disorder. She described the boy as vif lively, normal for his age. The school emphasized firm boundaries, structure, yes, but also, crucially, long, unstructured outdoor playtimes.
A different philosophy.
And the French pediatrician didn't just refill the U.S. prescription. They looked into the family's diet, sleep patterns, home environment. 6 months later, within this different psychosocial framework, the disorder seemed to mostly disappear. They successfully weaned him off the medication.
That case really highlights the core difference in approach. The dominant U.S. model, biomedical psychiatry, or BMP, tends to assume biology is destiny. ADHD is seen as a biological brain deficit needing a biological fixed stimulants.
Quick, seemingly simple.
Relatively, yes. Whereas traditional French child psychiatry resisted the DSM's influence for a long time. They used their own classification, the CFT-MEA, which focused much more on the psychosocial context.
So looking beyond the brain.
Exactly. prioritizing therapy, family counseling, looking at stress, nutrition, sleep, seeing the behavior as a symptom of an imbalance in the child's life, not just a fixed brain state.
The medication rates must reflect this difference dramatically.
Oh, they do. It's the starkest evidence. In the U.S., what did you say, around 9% of school-age kids diagnosed and medicated?
About that, yes, nearly 1 in 10.
Contrast that with France. Historically, the rate there was incredibly low, less than 0.5% as of 2017.
Less than 0.5% versus 9%. That's a massive gap.
It speaks volumes about the traditional French resistance to medicating children for these behaviors. In fact, Ritalin sales were so low in France back in the 80s that the manufacturer, Tsubagegi, actually let the license lapse in 1985. The market just wasn't there.
Wow. But have things stayed that way, or is the biomedical model spreading?
Well, that's the other side of the coin. More recently, there's been a shift in France, too, towards a more biological approach, partly pushed by health authorities recommending biomedical treatments. Ritalin prescriptions have increased dramatically there in recent years, maybe 70–80% over an 8-year period, though still starting from a very low base compared to the U.S.
So the trend globally is generally towards more medication.
Looking at the broader picture, yes. A study tracking 14 countries from 2001 to 2015 found overall medication use increased almost everywhere, but the levels remain wildly different.
Where is it highest and lowest?
Prevalence is still highest in North America, 4.5% of kids, 1.4% of adults on meds. Lowest in Western Europe, 0.7% of kids, only 0.03% of adults. Though some places buck the trend. Iceland hit high rates, 5% of kids by 2013, and Canada saw a huge surge, over 45% increase per year during the study, jumping from 0.2% to 1.8% of kids.
Even the types of medication vary, right? It's not all Ritalin everywhere.
No, definitely not. In the U.S., especially with private insurance, you see a lot of amphetamine-based drugs, like Adderall or Vyvanse, often as the primary treatment.
Or as elsewhere.
In many other places, Hong Kong, Canada, Spain, methylphenidate, which is Ritalin or Concerta, makes up over 90% of the prescriptions. The different drug profiles being used suggests that it's not just biology driving choices, but national guidelines, maybe marketing strategies, regulatory environments. It's localized.
Which brings us back to the diagnostic manuals themselves, the US-centric DSM versus the global ICD. You mentioned they've gotten closer but still have key differences.
Yes, ICD-11 has aligned more with DSM-5, but the philosophy still differs, especially around thresholds. DSM-5-TR is very specific. It lists 9 inattention symptoms, 9 hyperactivity impulsivity symptoms, and you need a fixed number 6 for kids, 5 for adults to get the diagnosis. It's algorithmic.
Very precise, almost like a checklist.
Right. Good for research reliability, which is a big goal for the APA. Critics might call it pseudo-precision, though.
And the ICD-11.
It has slightly different symptom lists, 11 for inattention, 11 for hyperactivity impulsivity, essentially splitting some DSM symptoms and adding nuances. But the key difference is the threshold. ICD-11 just says several symptoms need to be present.
Several? That's much vaguer.
It is. It puts more emphasis on clinical judgment, fits better with the dimensional view. But the downside is potentially less diagnostic reliability, especially across different clinicians.
Does the ICD include anything the DSM misses?
Interestingly, yes.
Mm-hmm.
ICD-11 has a symptom trying to capture that internal experience of impulsivity, something like acting without considering risks or consequences. It's about the lack of deliberation before the action.
Whereas DSM focuses more on the observable impulsive behaviors, like blurting out or interrupting.
Exactly. And this actually touches on a deeper research debate. Both manuals currently lump hyperactivity, HY, and impulsivity, IM, together. But quite a bit of research suggests they might be distinct factors. Maybe it should be a 3-factor model: inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity.
So merging them might obscure something important.
Potentially. By treating HY and IM as one thing, we might miss the chance to understand if impulsivity, that lack of internal deliberation the ICD hints at, is actually the core issue driving the behaviors. The current systems might be limiting our understanding. So when we pull all these threads together, what we've really uncovered today is that this whole framework for diagnosing childhood behavioral conditions, it's far from simple objective science.
It seems incredibly complex and messy.
It is. We've seen how the rulebook, the DSM, is heavily influenced by pharmaceutical money. We've explored how the criteria can end up labeling normal, if challenging, temperaments as disorders, especially when they don't fit neatly into standard schools.
Like the artisan temperament or kids with overexcitabilities.
Exactly. And crucially, we've seen how the decision to diagnose, and especially to medicate, changes dramatically depending on where you are in the world. It depends on culture, on medical philosophy, not just on some universal biological truth.
So looking at that huge variation in diagnosis rates across countries, the documented conflicts of interest in the bodies writing the definitions, and that powerful critique arguing the symptoms are often just a clash between a kid's innate nature and the demands of the classroom. It forces you, doesn't it? Forces you to confront this really significant possibility that what we call a disorder isn't always a fixed fact of nature. Sometimes, maybe often, it's a product of context, culture, and commerce.